Hello, very beautiful community. Let's rock and roll. In many ways, we are in a new world. We're not in the middle of that new world yet. We're just edging towards it. But the palpable sense of transformation is already available to us. And for some of you, it will be a version of a kind of normal because things change. History gives us periods of greater and lesser loveliness and greater and lesser stability. Others, most of you will be very disconcerted by what's happening. You'll be finding it too dark or too unintelligible. And that's why we're here to talk about it. The recent uh, security strategy report that the White House released is a formalization of many of the challenging things we'd heard from the United States in recent years. It's a very hypocritical document because it's attacking for democratic and liberal deficits the part of the world that is the least guilty of liberal and democratic deficit in the world, while being very, very guilty still, but the least guilty, that's Europe. And Europe is being attacked for lacking liberal and democratic credentials by an administration that is out to break the uh, counter institutional pluralism in US democracy. So this is an attack on freedom from an authoritarian vantage point, hypocritically asking for more freedom while offering authoritarianism. It's also a commentary on US decline, on US incapacity to govern itself, and on US incapacity to project its power globally. And here, what we've got to understand is the connection between domestic and international politics. Unless the Democrats offer a successful national project of renewal in the United States based on solidarity, based on economic democratization, based on securing the border without excessive cruelty. Unless they do that, which they could, but it's highly unlikely that they will, but they could, then the United States will likely become an illiberal power. And in becoming an illiberal power, the elimination of liberal democracy in Europe for the United States will become functional, just like the elimination of democracy in Ukraine is functional for Russia. It won't go that far. We're not talking about the United States doing a special military operation in France. But what we are talking about is the development of a functional interest for the United States for liberal and democratic ways of doing politics to extinguish themselves in Europe. Now, we shouldn't us and them this conversation too much because the very same patterns of democratic decline that are visible in the United States are also visible in Europe. If anything, we may just be an election cycle behind. So we shouldn't uh, giggle too much here on the European continent because we are unwell with the same political disease. So that's roughly where we are, beautiful community. How bad this is, what we can do about it, how we should feel about it, maybe some of what we'll discuss. We have a very beautiful principle, which is that we scroll up. Now, I can see that there are a lot of questions left upstairs before we started the live. And so I'm going to try to answer some of them liberally, but some of them just in a sentence. Um, I'm doing a few experiments with a technological glitch that keeps being reproduced. And if our live cuts out sound wise, I won't come back. Rather, I'm going to go away and buy a new computer because I've tried some other methods of fixing this And it's clear to me that might now be the next step. So if we cut out, um, hopefully we'll have it fixed by next time, but we won't come back again today. Let's rock and roll. Echelon, Vlad, almost a mechanical question. Where do woke sentiments and attitudes go when the ideology dwindles from individual psychological and a broader social perspective? So essentially, woke politics is taking political disagreement, moralizing it, taking moral disagreement, making it about identity, and taking identity based disagreement and insisting that one claim in identity disagreement ought to be entrenched at the expense of others by institutions and inculcated in future generations. That's the politics. What's the psychic background to this? So, when I make a hyper woke political claim, I might just be engaging in surface politics. It might not deeply reflect anything about my psychology. I might just be doing what you know it pays to do in the social world. However, if I am intransigently woke in a way that structures my life, and I go on saying things like Beethoven's music is racist because it's composed by a white man, um, or I take legitimate anti colonial arguments too far, or I take the extremely important rights of minority groups, but then claim that their rights never clash with anybody else's and they always need priority. So I kind of transcend politics with claims I make in favor of a minority group, which is always counterproductive, of course, right? One of the real tragedies for a very small, precious community in our culture, the community of trans people, is that many of their advocates made the claim for trans rights as though it couldn't conflict with the rights of other groups like biological women. And that proved to be quite a ubiquitous argument in trans discourse. And yet, literally not a single important political philosopher of the last half century could even entertain the notion that there might not actually be a real political conflict there. Of course, there is. And it's about politics resolving it. Um, when we talk about sports, when we talk about spaces, when we talk about who counts as what on the census, there is or women only political shortlists. There is room for political contestation there, obviously. And because the argument was made that there isn't such room, we're going to have a very unnecessary rollback of trans rights, um, which will mean that we will have to refight for trans rights from a non-work perspective to protect trans people from transphobic uh, post-conservative authoritarians. So we've been left in a real pickle in terms of minority protection. This is just one example. So what do I do psychically if I go too woke? A part of my mind can't tolerate another part of my mind. It can't tolerate the aggression, it can't tolerate the conflict, it can't tolerate the ambiguity. And so I need a defensive maneuver against this. And the defensive maneuver is a pursuit of moral purity externally as a consequence of my inability to tolerate my mind in a conflictive, sometimes aggressive, often ambivalent way, talking to itself. So one's inability to tolerate internal conflict leads to a defense that takes the form of a kind of purification. But what's really happened is that internal persecution has been externalized. So the woke person who is persecuting somebody else for not being pure enough is incapable of tolerating something that happens in their own mind. So, in the political sense, they're persecuting others. In the psychic sense, it's self persecution. So, the ideology is dying, woke ideology, and it'll even be removed from the universities. Don't celebrate that too much because it's not being replaced by renormalization. It's being replaced by a counter-majoritarian, authoritarian wave that aims to extinguish academic freedom even more than wokeism did. So let's be clear, 98% of anti-woke discourse on YouTube is not democratic and anti-woke in a constructive way. It's destructively anti-woke. J.D. Vance is not a non-woke person. He's an authoritarian anti-woke person, right? There's a big difference. So the defense will stay there when the ideology dies. The typical way for the defense to go is toward depoliticization. So it's toward other acts of purity that are no longer in the political realm. So it'll be around excessive definition of one's sexual identity, for instance. That might mean very pure ideas about the precise version of polyamory you want to practice. It might be very pure ideas about what position in bed you take, which to a healthy person is always a matter of exploration. To a pathological person is a matter of rigidity. And what you have to understand is that while that psychic unhealthiness will persist in the woke when their ideology is gone, it's not like the rest of society is healthy. In many ways, the Trump vote, some of it at least, and some of the authoritarian right vote in Europe is more sick than the woke are, because there is an element of the psychotic, for example, right, in a lot of the ex-conservative political support, because psychotic thought is the structure of it is roughly that you extract a sense of reality from your thought about the world. You find truth itself oppressive. We have an absolute epidemic of psychotic thoughts in our culture, and it's a great deal of psychotic thought that's become what it is in various tendencies, understandable tendencies of distrust that is driving a lot of the conservative right, ex-conservative right politics. Okay, enough. Let's try to be quick. EMEPAC, what chance do you estimate there is of Ukraine winning by default? Ukraine has, after various economic damages to Russia, leads to an endogenous regime change and withdrawal from Ukraine. Russia could collapse in a black swan event in the next year or two, sure. By Russia, I really mean the Putin regime. But it's just not something we should reasonably expect. We should regard it as possible, but very unlikely. Fundamentally, this depends on European support for Ukraine. Ukraine isn't going to win, obviously, on current trends, except if there is a black swan event. And a lot of Zelensky's politics for a couple of years now has actually been a matter of protraction of the conflict until such a point occurs that the black swan event happens in Russia. The trouble is that there's a chance that the Putin regime will collapse. But in November 2025, Ukrainian political collapse is more likely than Russian political collapse. And so this is the real problem with our discourse. 99% of our discourse is about Russian collapse. 90% of our discourse should be about how we prevent Ukrainian collapse. Because talking about Ukrainian collapse helps us understand that we need to support Ukraine more. Um, but we're not doing that. Instead, we're talking about a Russian collapse while the West is not doing anything to bring it about. We're not creating the conditions for the Putin regime to collapse, but we're just talking about it while insufficiently supporting Ukraine. And so I want to give a warning, therefore, to your question. We should focus much less on Russian collapse and much more on making sure that Ukraine doesn't collapse. Um, Otherwise, what we talk about becomes so distant from the reality of what Western powers are doing that we become a depoliticized laughing stock. There's a nuance to that, and that's that a lot of views that then generate support for Ukraine are generated by Russia will collapse narratives. And so there are some advantages to those, and they're also very entertaining to a lot of you. But they have the downside of risking depoliticization. Hey Vlad, you said Newtonify is saying you said Zelensky being under pressure makes him less likely to make concessions. I think it's a bit of both, more and less likely, but I think it's tendentiously less likely. How much is Putin able to make concessions, like accepting the current front line? Um, Insofar as there is a civic sentiment of a political kind in Russia at all, which there largely isn't, Putin is able to stop the war tomorrow because the predominant expression of that sentiment is fatigue with the war. The problem for Putin will not come the next day, it will come in the medium term when a question will be available, including asked by those who fought in the war. What did we do this for? What benefit did we get from this? And the answer won't be clear. But you see, this is not a liberal democratic critique of Putin. This is a Russian imperialist critique of Putin, which he would face. So it is existential for Putin to stop the war. He does think that stopping the war um, on the wrong terms could endanger his regime security, but it wouldn't be an overnight effect. And the Russian population at first would accept what he serves them by way of an explanation of why he stopped the war. But he knows that there is a very tight dependence that his regime security has on foreign escalation, and I would even argue war. Boycott USA. I see protests across the world. Government and businesses seem to actively ignore it. Is it time to try general strike? So that's a misunderstanding of the problem. The problem is not that we've got governments that are out of touch with a population united in a consensus that needs to act. What we've got is, in fact, the collapse of political channels to generate effective political outcomes. And what we've got is polarization. We've got a situation where the population precisely is at odds with itself about not just what it wants, but what the reality around it is. Um, and so the idea that the bottom needs to raise its voice to wake up the top doesn't work because the bottom is radically polarized into independent thought and mental world bubbles. UKDC Wobbly West. To Karmas, you've spoken before of the boat leaving safe harbors as a metaphor. Are you feeling the need to revise the established height of the waves um, we find in the open water? No, not at all. Um, there is nothing remotely worse than expected happening with this Trump administration. I mean, check out my video in November before Trump came to power called Trump's Authoritarian Revolution has begun. I mean, let's see if I can find what I say in it. I will be improving my way of doing this so I can do some split screens. But I mean, let's see what I said. We'll look at Trump's attack on institutions, the death of conservatism, Biden's legacy, and so on. Okay. Trump's second term will be a frontal attack on institutions to break a system in which power checks power. What's the aim of the game? The aim is to remake the American state in Trump's image and make the re-election of Trump's clan more likely by rigging the game in their favor. This is a case of democracy being used to undermine democracy. So no, there is nothing that's happening that's worse than what would be on par for us being 100 meters out of the bay. Nor will the waves in the 2030s be any bigger than I thought they would be a couple of years ago. Ruben, I read about the decline of the West. You often talk about imperial decline. What do you mean? Imperial decline means the degradation of US state capacity and the inability of the United States to project coherent, constructive or unconstructive, but coherent strategic power across the globe. Imperial decline. Democratic decline means that due to social forces like the untethering of social bonds, the internet, economic exclusion, ideologies of a very individualistic kind of self realization that generate feelings of betrayal, powerlessness, unsafety, and above all, a sense of opacity about politics. These social forces plus these sentiments are bringing it about that we are electing people who are after a power grab that's going to break our democratic institutions. What does it look like? It looks like you go to vote in the 2030s and you realize, oops, I can't get these folks out of power who are there. Right? Mario saying, do you think the UK should rejoin the EU? Um, realize that I'm a political actor in the UK. So I have a preference that's my own, that I would like to prevail, versus a preference that's a view about what stabilizes UK democracy more. I tend to have the two go together, but they don't always. So if there were a vote on rejoining the EU tomorrow, I'd obviously vote yes, because I live in Europe. I don't just live in the UK. Lyon, Berlin, Vienna, are, and even New York are cities in my country, really. And my country is Europe. Um, Secondly, my country is the UK. Thirdly, my country is England specifically. So I'd vote yes. I recommend that as a strategy for a political party. I'd say that the UK probably needs one major political party making that case. But what I think is more realistic is to reorchestrate Brexit and make it a bit softer rather than rejoin the EU. Um, I mean, the trouble there is that the EU is in long-term decline, as our democracies are, and the EU is um, inherently an institution that a set of institutions that generates distrust because they're so far removed from your everyday political reality. These are institutions that are, you know, even further from you than your national governments that are already very far from you. So the EU is in decline. It's not going to collapse. It's going to just degrade its capacity. And I'd vote yes, but my answer about what a major UK political party should do would not necessarily be the same. In Poland, many distrust newcomers. If you come, integrate fully, don't change our culture. Well, you guys are incredibly racist in Central Europe and Eastern Europe. We're racist too, but you're more. and you have a real problem with the notion of how to reconcile democracy and multiculturalism. What I would say is that the old way of talking about bringing people in, which is human rights discourse, is done. It's over. And so you need two things. You need a discourse, as Michael Ignatieff says, a discourse of the gift. You are gifting membership of your society to others. And that's not derived from abstract principles of rights. It's derived from your generosity and your capacity for that generosity. It's the first thing I would say. It's how you frame the debate. The second thing you say is that you can't bring people into the country until you generate civic consent for it. You can't just tell your population, you're a bunch of idiots. We need these people for our health service, let's say, as we might. We're going to bring them in, and then you can moan about it because you're an irrational moron. No, we need to reckon with people's felt sentiments about this on the doorstep. So you've got to battle to win the issue of civic consent first, bring people in second, not the other way around. If you fail to generate civic consent, you can't then do an immigration policy that's double what you have the civic consent to do. Otherwise, what you're going to lose is not your NHS, you're going to lose your democracy completely, to take the UK example. Vlad, how do you think Russia would react, Johan? How would Russia would react if one or several European countries announce that they'll develop nuclear weapons as opposed to the US as a response to the US withdrawal from the continent? Um, just distinguish between Western and Eastern Europe. Western powers developing nuclear weapons is a small no for the Russians. I mean, you already have US nuclear weapons platformed in non-nuclear West European countries. But East European countries having their own nuclear weapons is a huge no that the Russians would push very hard against. And Ukraine having nuclear weapons is a complete no. The Putin regime would rather just blow itself up than permit that. Pesloth. Media and Ukraine YouTubers have recently shifted to dark interpretations of the outcome of the war, first in Ukraine and later for Europe. Do you have an honest prediction? Are we screwed? You have to understand that we are in a long-term dynamic, which we might call Western democratic decline on the one end, and on the other end, on the other hand, the implosion of the Russian imperial project. This is not something that resolves in 1 or 2 years. The shape it's going to take, we won't know even 3 years from now, in all likelihood, even 5 years from now. So, a lot of this talk of who's going to win, who's going to lose 1 year from now is extraordinarily historically naive. You're looking at a 25, 30-year dynamic here. And in a year or two, we will still be in the beginning phase of whatever started with Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. We're not even in the middle yet. We're maybe approaching the end of the beginning soon. So put it into that context. What kinds of things are we on course for in the short term? Well, we're on course for Ukraine being allowed to survive just about, but to survive in such an impoverished way that um, it's a negative prognosis. The prognosis for Ukraine winning the peace would be a negative prognosis. It'd be very difficult for Ukraine to win the peace, given how weakly it has been set up by the West to do well in the war. That's roughly what we're looking at. If the war were to stop, we'd be looking at a very pro-Russian peace deal. That's what we're heading for. Daniel, is the Mexican president Claudia Scheinbaum a good example of a pro-democracy politician? No, she's not, but I don't want to legislate on that too much because I'm not a country expert by any stretch of the imagination. Um, but my instinct at the level of counter-majoritarian checks in Mexico, no, I wouldn't say so. How would you think about Islamophobia as a political force in the West? So there is a video on anti-Semitism in the West on this channel, which is a very comprehensive analysis, probably a 20-minute video. I'm going to make one for Islamophobia too, and I'm going to restate some of the anti-Semitism points in the long conversation about the West's sort of calamitous responsibility for Gaza. I'm going to do a very long form talk about that. Now, there are differences in the way Islamophobia and anti-Semitism work. There are overlaps, but also there are differences. One of the biggest things that we've got to understand is that we in the West, the religious and the non-religious we in the West, have an imminent frame that Muslim folks in Muslim countries do not have. That's to say, if I'm most kinds of Christian in the West, I'm not going to say that 77 political views I have all derived from my religion. I'm going to say I have my religion and then I have these political views, but it could be compatible with other political views. So there is that kind of division in our culture that is, in a way, ubiquitous in the modern world, but in a way not. There's much less of that division in other parts of the world. And therefore, what often tends to happen is that somebody in the Muslim world makes some kind of political proposal that sounds ghastly and does it in the name of religion. And we say that's what their religion says. But it doesn't. It's just that the person is speaking in a culture in which whatever they're going to say politically, they're going to attribute to their religion. And it's very important that we begin by having a long conversation about this sort of problematic nugget that I've just put on the table, which generates considerable and mutually self-reinforcing Islamophobia, because intolerant and extremist folks in Muslim countries see us happily lap up their own claims that the nonsense they're spouting is an expression of is the only expression of their religion, and so this is a mutually self-perpetuating process. The people making certain unlovely political claims are tying it to their religion, and then we are tying it to their religion for them even more. Whereas in fact, what we should realize is that a lot of what's happening is we're simply dealing with cultures where any political claim is going to be tied to a religion, and that's very difficult for us to get our heads around it because of the more imminent and separate way we live out uh, our religious experience. We are more secularized as religious Westerners. And so this creates an important challenge of comprehension for us. There's much more to say. This is the only thing I will say now. You said authoritarianism, Ross is saying, in the years ahead will be more irreversible. Is it for the same reasons as the factors driving democratic decline? Yes. A decapitation of 20th century dictatorships just restored democracy to some degree. That's absolutely not going to happen if you decapitate authoritarian regimes in 2038 in Europe. So we're going to have much less bad authoritarianism, but authoritarianism that's much harder to decapitate. I had a question at a more individual level. Andrew, if democratic decline continues, how do you think it might manifest and affect our interactions with co-workers and friends? To be more specific, might these interactions change from how they currently are as a result of a more post-truth and authoritarian atmosphere? The kinds of authoritarianism we're drifting into is the kind of authoritarianism that is very compatible with a high degree of private freedom that remains available to you, even if you don't, even if you can't express public freedoms. So we're not heading for North Korea. We're heading for free expression of your views on religion, art, sports, whatever you like, as long as you don't go too far criticizing your government, right? That's the predicament you're going to be in if your democracy collapses. So it's going to have a normalization of autocracy has a depoliticizing effect. Alex, uh, Kwame Anthony Appiah argues from a history of ideas view that the West is a recent and dubiously useful category. Can you say a bit more about your usage? Um, well, I can. Let's see what Kwame has said. There's no such thing as Western civilization. Sorry, I'm not putting this on the screen. Culture, like religion, nation, and race, provide a source of identity for contemporary humans. And like all three, it can become a form of confinement, conceptual mistakes, underwriting moral ones. Sure, sure. We live with 7 billion humans on a small warming planet. The cosmopolitan impulse that draws on our common humanity is no longer a luxury. Um, that's from the Wreath lectures. I think that sentence I don't love because I don't think there's any politics in cosmopolitanism. Um, but I don't see a conflict between admitting some of Kwame's qualifications and doing what I am doing. Um, when I talk about um, when I talk about the West, I really mean two things. I mean a certain kind of cultural political entity that has taken its current form by more than historical derivation. So the key distinction here is, do you have derivation or do you have something more than derivation? Derivation just means A comes after B, right? So I don't know, the modern world comes after the ancient regime, and different stages of the modern world come one after another. So is the European Enlightenment something toward which we stand in Europe and in North America in relation of mere historical derivation? Well, obviously not. We're enormously structured by it culturally and psychically. So the West is not a trivial concept, I'm sorry. Is the counter Enlightenment something in relation to which we have simply a dynamic of historical derivation, which just happened to come after it? No. We're enormously influenced by it. Um, so it's entirely contentful and appropriate to talk about the West. What you also have to understand is the pluralism within the West and the constraining and excessively ideologically bogus forms of defining the West that Kwame would object, which we probably could agree with for most on most of his points, I would imagine. So that's one remark. A second remark is that at any given historical moment, there is such a thing as a psychological homogeneity across cultures. So, for example, I am very at home in Central Europe. I'm very at home in Germany. I'm pretty at home in the UK. Not as at home as I am in Central Europe, but pretty at home. A bit less at home in France, but fairly at home. Um, a bit less at home in Spain and Italy, but sufficiently at home. Same for Greece. I'm then a bit less at home all of a sudden if we move to Czech and Hungary. I am then a lot less at home if we move to Belarus or Ukraine, and even less at home in Russia, and then even much, much less at home if we move to, uh, you know, the Caucasus, the Middle East, Asia, China. So these are all elements of these are all spaces of cultural proximity psychologically, and we can absolutely make these generalizations. You just palpably feel them, right? I am at home in a cafe in Berlin, and I'm very at home, but slightly less at home in a cafe in Prague. Um, I'm not at all at home in a cafe in China. Yeah. Um, so psychological remarks about proximity are important. Now, it was actually Kwame himself who once said that he would be more at home with some tribe in a small village in Africa than he would with George W. Bush. And so you could often make these kinds of observations too. Sure, sure. I see that. I see that. Um, I could be more at home with a Tongan fisherman than at George W. Bush's estate. I probably won't be. I'll probably be more at home with George W. Bush if we're realistic. Um, but it might be closer than people think. So sure, but that itself is a judgment about psychic cultural proximity. Gaffer Bob had a question, has a couple of questions. Could you please discuss which countries are more at risk for democratic decline? So I'll take your other question. The shorthand answer to this is homogeneity helps, and scale, small scale helps. So smaller, relatively more homogeneous countries with a long history of democracy, preferably stretching to the 19th century, will do better. Aaron, I'm able to pay attention to UK and US politics. I'm Canadian. Canadian politics triggers the bejesus out of me. What do I do? How do I improve? Um, you don't need to be in a daily cycle of consumption. You may benefit from engaging in longer form commentaries about your country that don't capture what happened on a Tuesday, but capture something that's happening over the course of 6 months, a year, and so on. So try to zoom out a little bit and be less located in the washing machine of daily politics. He has said what? She did what? I can't believe it, right? You can't physiologically do that to yourself 7 times a day. And always buffers first, always understand what gets you down, right? So, for example, I am not psychically damaged by absorbing information about calamitous politics, but I'm a bit of a freak, and no wonder I'm a political philosopher. I can do that. Um, my partner can't, my closest friend can't, and so on. So, right, you've got you got to understand what you are as well. You don't want to sort of understand that you have the capacity to absorb 10 kilos of shit when you have the capacity to absorb only 5. we are RRPP. You speak of needing to treat fellow citizens as opponents, not as enemies, but it's clear to many who already regard us as enemies. How is trust possible? The people who regard you as enemies in a Western democracy, you mostly have to treat as opponents and not enemies, with some exceptions. That's a generalization. Um, biz business something. Isn't the lack of trust in institutions based on some true issues with their ability in handling of modern technological and cultural trends? Should we not be focused on building new institutions like we did after World War II? We didn't build new domestic institutions after World War II. We had a revolution in, um, if you like, international jurisprudential norms that has largely collapsed now. That can't be rebuilt. Domestically, we didn't have a revolution. We had the decapitation of some authoritarian regimes. You're absolutely right that the problem is not that our institutions are just useless. It's more than that. It's that there are these social forces that I mentioned a few moments ago, including the internet, including the atomization of our society, the way that we haven't just generated this extraordinary imbalance in economic. We have generated this extraordinary imbalance in economic power, but we've also made people feel that their economic sort of trajectory is completely out of their own hands. Other social forces, of course, these make it nearly impossible for institutions to reverse democratic decline. However, they could do some things better. And what I call centrist technocracy is a real problem today because it's a solution that the European Union mostly uses. It's the solution that most center right, center left, centrist political parties use, but it's not any longer appropriate for our age because it is dependent on a scenario where there's a high degree of consensus in the population about values. We don't have that. We're polarized about values. We're even polarized about facts. In that kind of situation, you can't say we'll outsource our decisions on taxation, on immigration to an expert procedure, and that'll generate us the kind of result. And if the population don't like it, they should wise up. So this is the kind of technocratic um, governance that is accelerating needlessly democratic decline. My government in the UK is full of a lot of people with sound integrity, like my Prime Minister Keir Starmer, but they're doing this. Gaffer Bob towards a new computer. Is blatant hypocrisy an integral part of post-truth society? I think that a bigger part of post-truth society is the transcendence of hypocrisy. If you look at Trump, you recognize that he's not a hypocrite. He just says, I don't care to be judged by the standards that the Democrats are being judged by. I don't care if you point out that I've done some awful things or that I've done A on a Tuesday and then done not A on a Wednesday. So what? So hypocrisy is in many ways protective of decency in politics, because it means that you are less disinhibited to do unlovely things if when you do these unlovely things, you have to keep justifying why you didn't really want to, you didn't really mean to, or why you didn't really do what it looks like you did. Trump doesn't say that. He just says, I did it. What are you going to do about it? Okay, so what? So if anything, we are almost leaving the age of hypocrisy behind. And post-truth politics allows us to coexist with people in power who say A and not A on the same day. And we can't do anything about it because they just say, well, I said A and not A, and what are you going to do about it? So in many ways, we're in a much worse place than the grossest hypocrisy. We're in a place where we have transcended hypocrisy. and where you know you often have people saying, "Yeah, so what? You know, am I an authoritarian who uh, knocks other political actors for not being democratic enough? Yes, I am. So what? What are you going to do about it?" So I think that in a way, it's a much more pessimistic predicament than the thought that we are just sunk into ever deeper hypocrisy. We're in many ways entering a post-hypocrisy age. The age of Trump is the beginning of a post-truth, post-hypocrisy age. Mick, is this convergent fascist world order united by a woke enemy? I don't know what that means. As I said, I think wokeism is on the way out, and it's a form of a deformed liberal politics. If this convergent fascist world order takes hold, how long before they run on each other, and who is the leader? Before they turn on each other. So, make a distinction here between. Um, I don't want to say this is post-truth. Oh, I beg your pardon. I don't want to say this is fascist. I want to say that this is a form of monarchist authoritarianism of a hyper neoliberal kind that says that might is right and has a lot of fascist elements, but is also missing more fascist elements than it contains. That's how I would categorize this. So I think there are fascist elements. Um, Somebody zinged me on Twitter the other day for saying that there was a fascistized element to the new US government national security strategy. And I said, look, we've got to make a distinction. I don't think it's a good idea for Trump's political opponents to scream fascist all the time, partly because it consolidates a politics of enemies, partly because it strengthens Trump. It makes people feel that Trump, if he is really the F word, is sort of untouchably powerful. Um, Plus, it's just not a good way to get his voters to vote for somebody else. So, at the level of everyday political discourse, I still tendentiously recommend against the use of the F word. But if a political philosopher is asked to capture the ideological currents at hand, of course they're going to say there are some fascist elements there. Indeed, any ideology that's present in our culture, as I argue in the recent main channel video about the ideological convergence of Trumpism and Putinism, any ideology in our culture will implicate all of us. That's why on the fascist meter in that video, I started at 2 out of 10. In other words, I think everybody is a 2 out of 10 on the fascist meter because it's simply an ideology in our culture. And therefore, a 2 out of 10 fascist is essentially a non fascist in every meaningful respect because every ideology in our culture already impacts all of us. So all of you here are a tiny bit implicated in F ideology, obviously. Obviously, as soon as you go and watch my list of the ingredients, as I prefer to construe them of how we might think about fascism today, you're going to see that you're a tiny bit aligned with a couple of them to some extent, right? Um, and that's because, in fact, they are ways in which the F ideology overlaps with other ideologies. Even socialism overlaps with conservatism. If you're a socialist, you're going to have some conservative traits ideologically. If you're a conservative, you're going to have some socialist traits. So, um, but here is the key distinction, Mick. Don't confuse authoritarian leaders turning on each other from authoritarianism collapsing. This is still a big confusion in our community. When Trumpism collapses and Trumpism is going to implode, it's not going to be replaced by 1998 style liberal democracy. It's actually going to be replaced by worse form of authoritarian politics. So don't conflate the collapse of authoritarian projects with the collapse of authoritarianism. Right? Chester, what do you think of Alistair and Rory's interview of Zach Polanski, the leader of the UK Green Party, and Rory being upset that Zach didn't subscribe to the views of the right economists? Um, Zach calls himself a populist. he is different to Trump because, like Zoran and like Bernie, he is an inclusive populist. Everybody is included for him. He doesn't say the country is full of us and them. He is also a populist who is not out to break the democratic game and is not out to manipulate the very difference between truth and lies. Right? So far, he's a constructive politician. Where he is short of being constructive is that he is not truthful enough. Not in the sense that he lies, but in the sense that he hasn't taken seriously enough that there are certain things about his country that he needs to understand. Not about where his country needs to go in his view, but where his country is at and how it works. And so, to that extent, while there was outrage about Zach being criticized like this on the UK left, I roughly think that Zach's answers to Rory were not serious about the British economy. You can say, well, Zach's going to catch up on basic facts about the UK economy. And I say, sure, but the fact that he hasn't already is an expression of the kind of entrepreneurialism that is not completely detached from his work as a hypnotist in his past job. So that's the problem. So the problem in that interview was that a kind of self-advancement driven entrepreneurial streak manifested itself in that answer from Zach. What would a responsible version of the answer be on Zach's part if Zach was as ignorant about economics as he is? It would be this. Rory, Alistair, I'm new to this. I really care about my country. There's a lot to learn. I am not okay with what I know at the moment about the UK economy. I'm developing my ideas. And believe me that this is a project in motion. And I really care. And I'm not entrepreneurial or indifferent or lazy about this. I know that you know I am somebody who has a responsibility to deepen themselves on the basics, and that's what I'm doing. Having said this, I already have a fairly clear vision. Here it is. But that vision still needs more clarification. I'm not ready to do a budget now, and in fairness, he said that. But understand that, my not fully, being caught up with what it means to be a responsible politician doesn't mean I won't get there. Right. So what the spirit of the response had to be, if he responded in a way that wasn't a faceplant, and he faceplanted really badly, contrary to the lamentable defense of him by the UK left YouTubers. What he needed to do is say, hey guys, the UK is in trouble. We are on course to elect Nigel Farage, who is opposed to the authoritarian. Zach said that, in fairness. But then you need to say, this is why I'm jumping into the game, into the water. You need somebody who can do something about it, and nobody's doing anything about it. We've got this kind of complacent technocracy that is giving the country over to Farage. Somebody needs to do something about it. I have jumped in the game. Yeah, I'm not ready, but I need to become ready because nobody else is doing this. And that's why we've risen in the polls by a quadrillion percentage points in just a few months. I am not ready. But we have a real challenge here. We need urgently more constructive political voices in our discourse. So I'm doing this, and I agree with you. I'm not ready, but doesn't mean I won't be later, because I'm determined to make a constructive contribution. You see, you own where you are, but you don't concede anything at the level of your seriousness about your project. So that's how I would have balanced it. But he didn't. He tried to say, No, yes, I do. Yes, I do know about the economy, and yes, I watch YouTubers to learn about my economy. That wasn't an answer with ownership. Um, a confident politician in that place, and an ethical politician says, "Yeah, so what? Yeah, so what? Somebody needs to do this. I'm not ready, but I'm becoming ready. Have you got anything else you want to offer? What, more Keir Starmer? Sorry, it's not going to work. Farage is the next prime minister at this rate, right? So that's the confident answer. Moscow announced, Mick says, that the national security strategy released by the White House aligned with it quite a bit. US already owned EU. Why it has set us loose for conquest by Russia and China? EU future is conflict. There's quite a bit there. Yes, Peskov said that there were elements in the national security strategy that aligned with the Kremlin. A lot of elements. Sure. Yeah, that's where we are. What do you think of the majority reports frequent attacks on Ezra Klein, portraying him as the avatar for centrist technocratic establishment? Um, so I don't like this. I haven't watched the majority reports attacks on Ezra, but I don't like this because you've got to separate a political critique of, let's say, Ezra's co-written book Abundance, or of Ezra's politics behind the book, because somebody might argue the book actually is just compatible with different kinds of political projects. All it's talking about is a specific challenge of governmental efficacy, which can then be complemented by more or less left-wing programs depending on your um, political predilection. Um, Maybe behind it, you could say that Ezra is tendentiously a centrist technocrat. I think you'd run into some problems saying that. I think that Ezra's book and Ezra's commentary around it certainly doesn't challenge the damaging neoliberal legacy enough. So, to that extent, some of the left commentators might be right. But to turn this into an attack on Ezra, I don't accept as serious. So the kind of dismissive tone that the beautiful Kyle Kulinski uses with Ezra Klein, I just think is childish. Ezra is a jewel. Um, Ezra is a jewel. He's got some special skills as well, at the level of not 100% neurotypicity, allegedly. And that's also a wonderful gift. And he combines a tremendous facility for detail with an openness. Also, he's ringing the alarm bells about Trump. He's saying that the crisis is now. He has a realistic assessment of the problems with Trump. He has been realistic on wokeism and hyper-identity politics, even though he was himself a bit caught up in it a few years ago. He's trying really hard. He's working his socks off. I'm proud of him. I think he's a gem. He's a jewel. And if I could quintuple Ezra to create 5 Ezras, I would, for the benefit of political discourse in the United States. And that does not create a problem for the majority report, other platforms who want to say Ezra is too neoliberal. Say that. Doesn't change the fact that he's not a jewel. He's a very constructive and reliable, factually reliable, and open, evaluatively open contributor to discourse. So you see, I might myself think that Ezra doesn't go far enough in explaining to us how Clinton and Obama caused Trump. But I think he's an absolute precious jewel that we need to protect. Sorry to be so clear about this. This is where discourse is really important as something we think about procedurally. It's not constructive for childish left wing um, uh, remarks to disregard procedure in discourse. Wherever Ezra lands, he's procedurally very adequate. He might be wrong on this or that, but it's procedurally um, very adequate. Um, Somebody's saying we need one Ezra, not five. I'll deduct 1 point of likeness, which only brings you to 9 out of 10. So, of course, it's a misanthropic nightmare if you ever replicate a single person because you only need ever one of somebody. If we had five Vlads, it would be a cataclysmic disaster. I- Five sick Vlads, maybe not, because that amounts to one well Vlad. Now, maybe even 20 sick Vlads would amount to one well Vlad in terms of output. Um, but what I would say is we've got to pay attention to procedure more. Um, I give the same answer to Alistair Campbell critique. Alistair Campbell shouldn't be on the rest is politics because he is associated with the calamity of the Iraq War. I am sorry. We need all hands on deck. And the question is Alistair a constructive voice or not in our public discourse today? If he is, he's in. So that's how we have to think about this. We need to understand discourse a bit more procedurally. So it doesn't matter what you disagree about with uh, Ezra. Is Ezra open? Yes, on the whole. Is Ezra incredibly factually responsible? Yes. Um, is Ezra capable of synthesizing things in a special way? Yes. Is he able to react to changing political events? Yes. So uh, 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 we need to go like this with our discourse. You see, not like this. And I can see you. I haven't read exactly what you've written. I can see you just out of the tiny corner of my eye, Rachel, and I'm seeing that you're at risk of going a bit like this. And I'm recommending to go a bit like this, to go a bit like this, right? You don't bring in, you don't need to bring Alexander Dugin into this inner circle of discourse, but we need to bring in more people and understand that um, we're desperate. We're desperate for more hands on deck who are procedurally adequate, whether we share a political picture or not. Lost control and had a rant. I've virtually never succeeded in not having a rant. Okay, so does that mean we are 1 hour in and I've barely caught up? Um, could you give a real world example of an institution inculcating woke identity politics? Sure. A university renaming a building that was named after the philosopher David Hume because David Hume was racist, even though David Hume is one of the greatest Europeans who ever lived. Right. Um, the inability of um, certain departments in universities at the bureaucratic, not at a level of personal opinion of academics, to freely articulate positions that are critical of certain decolonization theses. The expectation that you subscribe to BLM um, or the claim that in every conceivable respect trans women are women um, in a way that's not recommended to you by colleagues on the corridor, which is entirely appropriate, but by university bureaucracy, which shouldn't have any business telling you anything. University bureaucracy shouldn't even tell you that Russia's invasion of Ukraine is wrong. It just shouldn't tell you that. So you can have a Ukrainian flag on your door as an academic, but the university office shouldn't have a Ukrainian flag on its door. You see the distinction. This is very important. This happened. Um, the climate movement got nearly completely asphyxiated in the West by wokeness. In other words, you basically couldn't get anywhere in the climate movement unless you committed to certain um, quite insupportable principles in the name of global justice. Um, in other words, they were principles that only a small minority of people who cared about the climate crisis could ever realistically entertain. So you sort of decapitated the possible pluralism of the movement. So it basically was no no climate action without climate justice, no climate justice without racial justice. Right. Now, I've been in with a sideways look on some of this stuff. I've seen how climate movements got absolutely permeated by this. I'm still planning to write a piece about this. And political parties. Um, Many progressive political parties simply got completely captured by entirely contestable political positions on various issues, with the demand that they institutionally enshrine these positions rather than the normal political reality whereby these just things that are up for debate, right? Um, and this is, as I say, this has caused enormous problems. And somebody like me, who, unlike the anti-woke ex-right, somebody like me who is very passionate about trans rights now feels that we've got significant rollback dangers and we're going to need to retell the story of trans rights um, in a new way and almost re-justify and re-include that group via a discourse that is different to the unsuccessful discourse that's tried to advance it, but has partly generated a backlash. Um, so this is very, very difficult stuff. But yes, there's across political movements, it's worse in the UK and in the United States than in other parts of the West. But um, so across climate, across politics, across academic institutions, and across media, we had a problem. Across media institutions, we had institutional capture along all of these. And the reality is that always, even at the peak of wokeism, most left-wing UK academics were anti-woke. They were just silent. I mean, I have a rough sense of what is happening in several university departments across the UK, just in terms of my networking. And I know very well that, yes, there are almost no conservative people in these departments, but most of the left-wing people in these departments did not like it, but stayed quiet. But as again, because we're online, I have to give a warning. 98% of anti-woke discourse is authoritarian, anti-democratic bullshit. So we've got to weigh this up. And that's why I'm almost a minority voice, unfortunately, who passionately believes in structural disadvantage of various kinds, but does not believe in hyper-identity politics. And one of the basic things that we're going to learn now is that the interpenetration of economic disadvantage and other types of group disadvantage is ironically for all of the intersectional discourse was not properly grasped by much of the so-called intersectional discourse. Okay, completely out of control ranting from me today. Let's have a look where we are. How does the intolerance paradox work in a polarized society? This is a very big question about tolerating the intolerant. I think we need to have a separate conversation about this. The only thing I would say about toleration for now is that toleration is a negative value. Our rather self-indulgent period in the West of 1989 till 2014 led us to think that um, we didn't need to tolerate what we found revolting or ethically really objectionable, that we need to tolerate something we're just not quite in love with. But no, toleration is about rejection, right? Your capacity for toleration is a capacity to coexist with what offends you. But I'm extremely grateful for all of these questions, um, because I think we need to be talking more about discourse, and we need to be talking more about responsible discourse. And so I'm seeing a few comments about that. I think that's really important. And even if you disagree with one another about that, just talking about what's responsible and what's not responsible discourse is incredibly important. We don't do enough procedural reflection on this. We just say, is somebody making claims ABC, which I agree with, they are great. Well, but do you care if they are also doing that in a very irresponsible or entrepreneurial way? That matters too. Rachel says the climate movement has been stilted way more by the fossil fuel lobbying efforts. So I'm talking about how it got stilted from inside. I mean, you're so right about how it got stilted from the outside that that's not even the right framing for it. The fossil fuel uh, lobbyists have not just stilted the climate movement, they've stilted our capacity to respond to the climate crisis, right? In a very manipulative way, starting from the 1980s. I'll give you another extreme example of wokeism because I do this diary called Vlad's Diary. I sometimes did it on Twitter as well, even a year or two, more than a year or two ago. And I got a lot of correspondence, like hate mail correspondence, from disabled people who criticized me for saying that being chronically ill and disabled is a bad thing. So the argument was that being chronically ill and disabled is only a bad thing from the vantage point of a capitalist conception of what it means to lead a good life. Um, Everybody who wrote that was American, by the way. And I got quite a few messages like that, which is such an unbelievable evasion of reality in the name of self congratulatory, identity affirming slogans, because it was full of false consciousness. One of these people who wrote this was wheelchair bound. Now, you can be wheelchair bound and not suffer. You might be disabled without being ill, of course. But these were mostly ill people who were writing. That's a really extreme example of wokeism, and don't make the mistake that it's been absent from the disability movement. It's big in the disability movement, and literally, when I suffocate, and 2 of the last 4 nights I spent 10 hours suffocating, um, I am overwhelmed with empathy for other chronically ill people going through similar things across the globe. And I'm passionate about their rights, about their political exclusion. But when I feel this deep sisterhood and siblinghood and brotherhood with them, um, I don't feel, um, oh, the problem we have got is that the capitalist system has constructed a concept of illness that makes it out that our lives are bad. The empathy I feel is that these people want to live their lives. They want to get a job. They want to, play badminton and play the flute. They want to play with their children. Um, that is probably, in sort of my personal experience, the most epistemically weird example of wokeism. Maybe together with what I've encountered in a few musicology departments, where people genuinely wanted to say that the conception we use to evaluate the quality of Mozart's and Beethoven's music is a white and male conception. And once we abstract away from it, then these people become average composers. And you see how blind wokeism can be to actual issues of exclusion. Because if you're born in the year Beethoven is born in 1770, and you're a woman with Beethoven's musical talent, you're not becoming a composer. I'm sorry. Even though there is this extraordinary, almost biological drive in these people to write music, I'd still bet against you if you're a woman. So women were not allowed to develop their musical talent in Vienna in 1770 the way men were. You're not feminist enough if you run the woke story that Beethoven is an average composer. He is a composer of the greatest genius, if you just look at the score. Um, but the problem is that there's also this exclusion of women from the profession because they weren't allowed to realize their talents. Vlad, you have completely lost control with non-stop ranting. You've brought nothing but ranting to this live. You're clearly suffering massive self-regulation problems due to your due to your health struggles. Do some meditation, which I do. Um, Julian is asking, have I experienced any NHS discrimination giving me less priority because I'm a white man? So I've experienced some NHS discrimination, but I think it would have been worse if I wasn't a white man. So I'll give you an example. Despite written documents, I was denied oxygen at an NHS hospital for a couple of days, which played a significant causal role, I believe, in my potentially permanently losing the ability to stand over the last 7 months. Um, so and that's one of a zillion examples. Probably this is by far the worst one of NHS um, malpractice. But um, tendentiously, when I'm in the doctor's office, it's very hard for a doctor not to believe me because I'm confident, I'm calm, and I am male and white, and that unfortunately helps. I would be less hurt if I were a woman, and I would be less hurt if I were a black or brown woman, clearly. So I certainly, in a non-woke way, want to assert that I have some, of course, some um, white male privilege. But that's not really enough to bring it about that the NHS knows what they're doing with long COVID and ME. They don't. Please don't mention wine, Amalfitano, because I can't drink wine at the moment. I'm going to do a Christmas wine recommendation video. Um, and what I'm going to do, I'm going to taste wine from war zones. I'm not going to swallow it because I'm not allowed, but I'm going to taste and spit wine from war zones and give some Christmas wine tips. Um, Alex is saying, is the removal of monuments, including some Confederate monuments, in the same waters as some of the um, uh, woke politicking you're talking about? Um, Certainly, it may be okay to A, take down some monuments, or B, adjust some monuments. But um, uh, the monuments politics has went too far. Um, I'm just going to see if I can think of any examples. Yes, I mean, um, there was the Cecil Rhodes, and you know about Rhodes scholars. There was the Cecil Rhodes um, controversy where folks wanted to remove his statue, and we had thousands of cases like this. And what you have to do is keep two things in mind there. That um, you've got somebody with a very complicated and ethically unlovely biography. You've also got somebody associated with, so many people from all over the world getting an opportunity to study. So it's about keeping two things in mind. And of course, you should be able to realize that certain things are part of your history, for better or worse, and face that. So there's a kind of very, very sick, toxic, and historical disposition that goes with the thought that you've got to purify your past. Your past is not pure. Your present is not pure. Forget about your past. So yes, in some cases, it's appropriate to adjust a statue or remove it. But most of the woke controversies about statues across the West were BS and should have been rejected by the institutions, right? If you want to rename a building, I just want to make sure I've not dreamt this example up. Yeah, 2020, Edinburgh University renames David Hume Tower over racist views, right? I would be disgusted to belong to an institution that did that. Absolutely disgusted. It's an elementary attack on Western civilization and the greatest philosopher this island has ever produced. Enough. Because what's very important when we do this, um, it's very important that when we do this, that uh, we recognize that we're not doing the Jordan Peterson move of disparaging the disadvantaged groups for whom wokeism advocated. 4 or 5 point definition of wokeism, Rachel, from political disagreement to moral disagreement, from moral disagreement to identity-based disagreement, from identity-based disagreement to its entrenchment in institutions. Then there's the empirical question of how far that got embedded in particular institutions. This is quite well defined conceptually and empirically. Um, so some people here don't recognize that that's a thing, but it'd be interesting to see how many do, how many don't. When you conceptualize things, when you articulate them, you don't have any control over how people receive it. So all I can do is do my best, but it's, I feel a deep responsibility to articulate this. I mean, Ukraine is also facing this kind of statue issue, um, this kind of monument issue, and what would be a woke and what would be a non-woke way of handling it? Well, Um, Imagine there is a statue of a Russian writer that got put there in a kind of way that suggests that it was just a stamp that you know was generated for political rather than cultural reasons. Take it down. Whether it's Lenin or Pushkin, take it down. Um, if you have a statue that's been there for 100 years, and it was a statue that the students of a Ukrainian institution raised money to put up. It's a hybrid person, as part of the Ukrainian history, part of it is in Russian history. Um, there, obviously, uh, constructive politics would say keep it. Jeremy, how can democracies acknowledge and hold conservative effect without technocratic dismissal? I don't understand your question. I'm sorry. Yeah, I do think some people are saying, I've spoken about it probably 79 times, but people are wanting a one off place to find my account of it. It's going to be in several videos, and I recommend more recent ones. Um, but I'm going to probably do an individual chat on it because it's just so um, in demand. And then some people are still going to say, sorry, Vlad, I don't recognize what you're saying. I probably need to do that on several topics, actually, because I constantly feel like I don't have enough standalone videos on particular issues. Like I get asked, "What's democratic decline?" 7 times a day. Um, so it's very important that I actually improve the resources that I make available on the concepts that I deploy. All right, we're at 1 hour 30. Let's take a couple of questions. I have derailed us. It's not you guys if the comment section looks a bit um, wonky. I have derailed us off topic. It's not you, it's me. I screwed up today with my ranting. Let me see if I can see a question mark. I live in Poland, Matty Math is saying, and I'm constantly worried we'll find ourselves at war with Russia within 10, 20 years. How likely do you find that? I find a full scale war between any European country and Russia very unlikely. I find a conflict between Russia and European countries that challenges Article 5, although what Article 5 is itself a murky question. And what it is today is a murky question. Um, uh, I would say that you're not going to expect a full-scale invasion, but you are going to expect escalation. and you are going to expect some kind of challenge. I mean, I constantly get this question from the Baltics, Vlad, should I leave in case the Russians invade? And what I say is that um, the Russians might well do a low threshold challenge of Article 5. Sorry, this is a broken record. I've said this before in the Baltics or elsewhere. But that's not the same as an invasion, and that's not the same as a full scale war with Europe, because the very point of the Russians challenging Article 5 um, would be to avoid a full scale war with Europe and NATO. The point would be to demonstrate that NATO cannot act effectively. That might mean, I don't know, military experts need to clarify this, not me, but that might mean, I don't know, dropping a couple of bombs on um, NATO soldiers in the Baltics, and then NATO not doing anything about it. So these are the kinds of scenarios where you're looking at something that's more than escalation, but much less than full scale war. The point of the Russian provocation will be the avoidance of full scale war. Um, it's a personal issue if you're in the Baltics, how you feel about the Russian threat and whether you apprehensive to stay where you are. But I personally say don't expect a full scale Russian invasion. Um, Even if the Russians had capacity for it, that's not what I would necessarily expect. Um, what you really should expect is just the collapse of the continuation of the collapse of European security arrangements that we inherited from the post 1989 world. So that's what you can expect. You can expect more nations having to be out there for themselves. So the alarmists are right that Russia may challenge Article 5 more than the calmists allow. The calmists are right that Russia is not going to engage in a full scale invasion of NATO countries. Yeah, somebody's making a good point. The other thing is that what you fundamentally want to avoid in Poland is your government just looking like Polish Putinism in 15 years. Yeah, you don't want to revert back to an escalating authoritarian right politics that just means that you don't need Putin to invade you because you've done it to yourself. That's the danger for all of us. Shipyanka is asking me about the far right in Ukraine. I think I want to perhaps have a separate conversation about that. I think that in a post cessation of war Ukraine, there's going to be a set of factions with very different kinds of toxicity. There's going to be a faction drifting toward Russia among some political elites. There is going to be a faction um, um, that's all about what would worry us in the shape of a far right. Um, so I think that conversation is best had as a conversation about how Ukraine wins the peace. Let's take one last question from Christoph. You've said Putin views Western democracies as weak and seeks to undermine them. What does he think comes next? Given the last time Europe turned authoritarian, its tanks almost reached Europe. Putin expects um, authoritarian right to be in power in Germany, in France, in Italy, in Spain, in the UK. And for there to follow a kind of renormalization of relations that he feels he may be beginning to experience with Trump, but he is perilously untrusting of the fact that Trumpist forces are going to win the next presidential election. So Putin is extremely insecure about his bond with Trump. But he thinks that history is going in the right direction here, that there's going to be essentially an urbanization of the elites in most major Western countries. What follows for Putin from that is that he doesn't really care what happens in Western democracies, but he will be allowed to exercise greater power in dictating security arrangements in more of Eastern Europe than he currently can. That's what he hopes for, combined, of course, with regime security at home. Keeping power at home is his overriding ambition. Um, okay, awards to everybody for surviving my ranting. Thank you so, so much for being with me. Lots of love. I'm going to get some oxygen and talk to you soon. Bye bye, beautiful community.